Thank you so much for joining us for another Wednesday night session of our Clear-Sighted series. And we've been dealing with a lot of different issues from the perspective that the Bible gives us, issues that we feel deeply about and issues that are definitely on the front page in our culture right now. And today's is no different. So I want to just introduce our panel to you as we begin. To my right, we have Pastor Matty Ponce de Leon, pastor at Arlington First Baptist Church. We also have Sonia and John Creason. They are members here at Elkin Valley Baptist Church, and they are, all three of these have been involved in working in recovery ministry for many years, each of them about a decade in active ministry towards recovery. And when we talk about addiction and recovery, there's a lot of things we could discuss. It's a whole can of worms. We're going to dig into a little bit today. Specifically, this series, we're trying to see what it has, how the gospel impacts addiction, how the gospel impacts recovery, and what that looks like in the church and in individuals' lives. So that's the direction we're going to go. And each time we do this, we try and start with a definition. I'm just going to go ahead and start with Pastor Matty as we talk about defining. Basically, addiction is where we want to start. If we're going to talk about addiction and recovery, will you share with us your definition of addiction, and then we're going to kind of round that out with the other panelists. If you'll start us there.
Well, just right off the bat, defining addiction really depends on what camp you're coming from, how it is that you view the issue of addiction, and from where you're speaking from. There are some clinical definitions of addiction that you can find at NIH, American Medical Association. There is certainly an aspect of addiction that I more speak toward, that is that of spiritual warfare. From a Christian standpoint and from a scriptural standpoint, if we're looking at it through a biblical worldview, I would certainly say that addiction is an aspect of spiritual warfare, ultimately because of what is accomplished through addiction. Ultimately, because of what is accomplished through addiction, I would say that it is an issue of spiritual warfare. I've got a couple of definitions. The NIH describes addiction as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking. American Medical Association is the one that is sort of famous for having defined addiction as a disease, and also notes the chronic nature and compulsive nature of addiction. It's important to understand what compulsion is. Compulsion is that irresistible urge, no matter what the consequences are. So those are just some views from a secular standpoint, but also from a Christian standpoint and from a biblical standpoint in regard to what addiction is as I see it and as I have encountered in my work.
How would y'all like to round out the discussion of defining addiction? He used two words, chronic and compulsive. Does that match up with your experiences in the same realm?
Well, with my experience, addiction is anything. Once you start, you want more of, and you can't stop until something happens to stop you. It's something, an overwhelming desire to have something that's bad for you or wrong for you. Addiction, and as far as, from where I come from, with alcoholism and things like that, it's wanting some more of, and once you're started, you're not able to stop, until there's some kind of intervening thing that happens, whether it be hospitalization or detox or being incarcerated.
So, real quick, you mentioned something there that I'd like to touch on. You said it's anything that we want to define the scope a little bit. If you can, help us with some categories. And Sonia, if you want to chime in with John as well, that's fine. But as we continue to round out this definition, talk about the scope a little bit. You said anything. Help us with that.
Yeah, addiction, for someone who's, prone to addiction, and which many of us are, and it can somewhat be anything: gambling, pornography, chemical dependence, things like that. It's something that's, addiction, and from where, my point of view is what I'm concerned with is the addiction of things that are harmful to you and to others.
That's a pretty important point, right?
Yeah.
Things that are harmful to you and others. Okay, good. Keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, and the flip side of that is there's nothing wrong with being addicted to Jesus. If we're addicted to things like that and doing, then that's a different story there. When I got into recovery, went overboard with with Jesus, and that didn't harm me. It didn't harm others. It actually helped. But those type of things. But most of the time, what the problem we have is the addictions that are tearing not only my life apart, but the others' lives around me apart as well, because it not only affects the person, but anybody that's associated with that person.
Right.
It touches, just like the gospel can touch everyone around you. Addiction to things that are harmful to you and to others will touch everybody you come in contact with as well. You know.
So keep us going here, Sonia. We've heard about harmful, we've heard about chronic, we've heard about compulsive. Help us continue to round out this definition of addiction.
Well, I went through and looked up a lot of different definitions when we started this, just because I think the root of the word is just so important, because it's misconstrued. And so I like this one, and it kind of reiterates what they've said, but it's per the ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine. Addiction is a treatable, chronic medical disease involving complex interaction among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. And that last part, despite the harmful consequences, that's what is so different about, anything that brings us pleasure we can be addicted to. It comes with like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, that kind of stuff, the hormones that make us feel good. But when it has the consequences, that's the problem. So from that standpoint, that's kind of how it wraps it all up, the definition for me.
And therein, I think, lies the disconnect a lot of the time, and why those who don't struggle with addiction have such a hard time in understanding it. It is observing it from a distance, so to speak, and what they are observing is that, it's irrational behavior. There is this compulsive behavior, there's consequences that are taking place, and generally, if there's consequences that are taking place, that will often cause us to shift our behavior in our lives. But for one who is addicted and has that compulsion and continues in that compulsion regardless of the consequences, to one that's on the outside looking in, there's a strong disconnect there, and really a bridge that needs to be crossed in order to understand what the addict is going through in their behavior as well.
And I think that's important for us to hear, especially, I trust there'll be people viewing this who haven't experienced either alcoholism or drug addiction of some type. But there's other things that they might be doing that they don't even see has that same negative consequence. So it's a very large, complex issue, as we've addressed. Mm-hmm. If all this is true, then what should be the goal of recovery? As we start talking about addiction, we don't want to just talk about the problem, because it's easy to point out a problem. But we want to talk about, are there solutions? And specifically, how does the Bible, the scriptures, how do they address solutions? Whoever wants to start us on that, the goal or recovery, or what would that be? What would that look like? Go ahead, John.
There has to be a complete change. One book says a complete psychic change. That's a change of a mind, a complete turnaround. What that looks like from a Christian standpoint, is repentance, things like that. It's a soul, heart. Things have to change. There has to be a complete change. The old person has to die so the new person can live. From that aspect, it just things have to change. I mean, change is one of the keys, and it's a heart thing. It's a mind thing. Everything, I had to be reprogrammed, I guess you could say, but it was just, I had to turn away from that old life and everything that I knew and look towards God.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Either of you two want to jump in on that?
So from a clinical standpoint, clinical recovery is the cessation of addicts, of addiction, the removal of symptoms, restoration of social function, and becoming a productive member of society. Now, that's from the clinical standpoint, with a lot of emphasis on the restoration of self and then becoming, like I said, the active and productive member of society. But with that being said, the other part of that is like what John was hitting on, finding a substitution for whatever the addiction is and improving on the spiritual condition, and then also discipleship. So it's like that ultimate follow through. Like he was saying, the change, the restoration, and then taking what you have learned and discipling somebody else. So it's kind of a twofold thing. I mean, it's the clinical part, but then it's also the spiritual part too.
Right.
Well, I just real quick, just the whole change. One thing I learned real quick is that I had to change and I couldn't do it. I had to have someone else to help me.
And that goes back to because addiction is compulsive and chronic, right?
Yes.
So you didn't have what it took in and of yourself.
I couldn't make the change. It had to be God too. It had to be, it had to be God. I had to ask others for help.
Matt, do you want to add to discussion on recovery?
Well, just also in regard to that change, and I don't want to backtrack into the problem, but as the AMA describes addiction as a disease, and I'm not really being a proponent for that perspective, but just using this clinical description of it being a combination or being caused by a combination of behavioral, environmental, and biological factors, there's a whole lot of things that are in play. It is a very pervasive issue, and the scope of it is very broad, not only in the impact that it has, but in the different ways that one can be addicted and the damage and the impact that it has on others. But as you consider all of those things, the change is then a dramatic one, and it is a change that goes beyond anything that one who is mired in that compulsive behavior can facilitate on their own. There is some requirement of outside help, and I would say that probably universally here on this panel, we would all agree where that outside help comes from, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And with that brings about the change that we can't facilitate on our own. In Romans chapter 6, it talks about that description that we have to not yield our bodies as instruments of unrighteousness. It's basically saying in the scripture there to stop sinning. And if I could have done that, I would have done that many, many years ago. If I could have done that on my own, if I could just stop doing the things that were ultimately being destructive in my life and the life of those that are around me. But it is a matter of choice. It is a matter of choice in regard to whether or not we get high or drink or not. But the choice is not sin or don't sin. It's not drink or don't drink, get high or don't get high. It is do all of those things that we have the compulsion to do, or seek God with all our heart, our soul, our strength, and our mind. As the King James says, yield yourself unto God as those that are alive from the dead. So ultimately, that is how the change is facilitated from addiction, because it's something that's so much beyond what we can do on our own.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit. Let's just assume there's somebody watching this who is currently dealing with addiction themselves. What hope comes? I mean, if it's as far-reaching as we've described, and it's as almost helpless as it sounds, is it also hopeless? So if it's not something that the person watching can just stop doing it, then where is the hope coming from? You guys have been working in recovery ministry, for decades between the three of you. What have you seen that brings about that change you talked about? You described change. Can you tell the people watching, especially those who might be personally struggling, where that hope comes from and how that change can take place? Whoever wants to start.
Well, I'd just like to prompt two things that I've heard both John and Sonia say. One of them is in regard to the dramatic change that needs to take place. There is something that's beyond ourselves that needs to happen. But then also, Sonia used that word discipleship. And it is a change that then needs to be nurtured and developed and grown. And I always am very strong in my perspective in regard to this being an issue of Christian discipleship. We have a responsibility as Christians and as the church to nurture those that are mired in addiction once that initial change takes place, to develop them in bringing that change about.
I think it's really important for people to know that there's nothing that you have done in your past that will keep you from God loving you. There's nothing that you have done ever. So you can't live in fear of sobriety. If your life has lost its meaning and you don't have anywhere else to turn, then why not make the change to do something better? And then once you're able to start living that life, you realize that you can only keep what you have by giving it away to other people. And that's what we were talking about before. There's help available. Just between us three people, and I'm sure Stephen too, everyone in this church who knows anything about addiction and recovery can point you in the right direction. There are places available, there's people available that will help you, and we can help. It's not something that you ever have to do alone.
Yeah.
And that's really important because a lot of people isolate and they get so far down that they can't see the light. And they just need to know that there are people here who love them, accept them, they're not going to judge, and just want them to be as happy as everybody else, We make it into a huge thing in our head, but it's pretty simple when you get down to it.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. John, what would you say to somebody who's watching that's struggling with addiction and doesn't see a way out? Where's the hope going to come from?
Well, first off, you don't have to live that way anymore. You need to reach out and ask for help. It's a very humbling thing, but asking for help. I remember years and years ago, I knew I needed help, but I didn't know where. I didn't know who from, what from, but I sought out that help, tried to, and God, I started trying to seek God, and ask Him for help from others. There is hope because, the hope is that, there's people out there that are willing to go to any length to help someone else, me and any others people, we, a lot of times we'll be quiet and think we're the only one, and it wasn't until I got into recovery that I realized that I was not the only one. And the thing is that, if you need help, seek help because you can't do it alone. It's already been said, and I won't repeat, but, if we could do it ourselves, we would have done a long time ago. But just like any other sin, any other problem that we have, that's just, we need help in that area. It's just like we need support. Asking your pastor, calling these hospitals and treatment centers, seeking out that thing, if you want it, it's just like God, if you want God, God's going to come to, it's going to come closer. You seek God, He's there, He's just waiting. So there is hope, there is hope. And the one big thing is that you do not have to be perfect. You don't have to get your stuff together and then ask for help. That's certainly, it's not the case.
That's not how the gospel works, is it?
It's not how the gospel works either. Because if I didn't, and just to go back a little bit, it's just, it wasn't until I realized how spiritually bankrupt and how empty I was and how disconnected I was from God that I really started asking for help and just said, all right, you can have it all. I can't do this anymore. I hear countless of guys that come to the house that they've lost everything 2 or 3 times. Their kids ask them to stop drinking. Their family, leaves them because of, and all these things, that's how, when in the midst of their addiction, they still keep doing it, and that's the pull, and it just, and it takes a point to where you realize that, that for me, I was just spiritually, it was nothing. I had nothing, you know. Many guys come, or, you know, and this is in recovery, period, you know, and they want to have the desire to quit. They want to have that desire, but they don't have the desire, but they want to.
Yeah,
And this might sound silly, but they want to quit.
sure.
I see that a lot, but there is hope. There's countless, I see it all the time. You know, there's people that have recovered. I've recovered, several, you know, that are, you know, living life. And I've been given a purpose today. You know, so that's another thing. But
That's good. Yeah, thank you. And all of y'all are sharing those heartfelt responses. So we've kind of hammered out a little bit of what addiction is, what recovery is, and that there is a way out. Let's talk about how people end up in addiction. So, you know, there's different thought processes. Is addiction simply a matter of people making bad choices? Is it a medical or mental disposition that somebody's born with? You know, maybe, you know, a couple of y'all, three of y'all, however, answer that, you know, kind of just help us understand what would make somebody end up in addiction. Is it environmental causes, medical causes, whatever? Just walk us through that a little bit, because I think what we'll hear is that it can be impactful in a lot of different people's lives from a lot of different backgrounds. So there's not one type of person, I don't think, that ends up addicted, but what is it? Is there a common denominator? Help us understand that a little bit more.
Well, I think from the standpoint of what I shared earlier in regard to it being an aspect of spiritual warfare, there really is because we are all sinners by nature and by choice, because there's not one righteous, no, not one. We all have that tendency. We are bent or crooked in that way. That means that we are all susceptible to various forms of temptation, and there's a particular percentage of humanity that is more susceptible to that form of temptation. The scripture tells us that every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust, of his own desire, and then enticed. So if we're just going about business, doing things our own way, living life our own way, we are then more susceptible to the temptations that the enemy would put out in front of us. That reality is something that I think is helpful in understanding the addict, and something that we all need to come to terms with. In Ephesians, it tells us to be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. I'm giving the King James Version here. And as we look at that word excess, it's that word for salvation, but it's actually the opposite of the word for being saved. Now, nobody thinks that they're going to drink a beer and go to heaven. That's not the kind of deliverance or salvation we're talking about here. But the scripture itself tells us the very reason why it is that people seek that drunkenness or that intoxication, or if you want to broaden it a little bit, that satisfaction that comes for looking for fulfillment in the things of this world. They are looking for some kind of deliverance. They're looking for some kind of escape. And that is, I think, fundamental in understanding what addiction is and what drives addiction. And that ultimately, if we're looking for escape from life in some way, that means that there's not something right with us before the drink or the drug, before any of the addictive behavior. There's something that's missing for us in the first place. So it's part of a search, really. It's part of a search to fill a hole of something that is missing in life. And not everybody goes down that road,
Right.
but a certain percentage of our society does.
I think you used the word empty, didn't you, a minute ago when you were talking? And that's what you're referring to? There's an emptiness that you're trying to fill with something.
Yes.
And some people choose to fill that with drugs or alcohol or whatever substance. Others might choose another form of addiction. You guys want to jump in on this too, in terms of maybe the causes behind addiction.
I think that, and this is just from my personal experience working in this field for 10 plus years. There's a whole lot of underlying issues, mental health issues, depression, anxiety, a lot of childhood or early trauma that people, instead of developing healthy coping mechanisms, then they go to that to numb it out, to escape, like what you were saying.
What you said, numb it out?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
so you don't feel that pain
Instead of,
anymore.
right,
Yeah.
to cover up the pain instead of, for whatever reason, dealing with it directly. So I think also there is such a stigma associated with this, that there's a lot of people who shy away from recovery when they shouldn't, you know. And so if we look at it as a disease, if you have high blood pressure, you go to the doctor, you take your medicine, you comply with your diet. So if you say addiction and alcoholism are diseases, it would lessen the stigma. It would be more accepted in our society, and maybe more people would seek treatment to where they didn't have to go into institutions. They didn't have to go into jail. They didn't have to die. And they could be happy, joyous, and free and live a Christ-centered life. So,
Yeah, I'll start off by saying what, my solution today, and what I found is that the source of my joy is in Jesus. That's my source of my joy. Before that, I was feeling that emptiness with all other sorts of things, anything that would make me feel different. Working in recovery particular halfway house, there's no set pattern. There's just I've from people, guys from 18 years old up into their 60s. Some have had a horrible childhood. Mother and father drank, did drugs, everything like that, even pushed drugs on them when they were in their single digits, and then ones that come in there, the mother or father, was just, Christian and just went to church every Sunday, never had drugs or alcohol, not even
variety of backgrounds.
Yeah, a variety of backgrounds. I mean, there wasn't no set pattern. It was just nothing there. It was just there's no picture perfect. Well, this person's going to be alcoholic and addict. Of course, you get you hear from from the biological and the genealogy. Grandfather was an alcoholic, father was the alcoholic, and very much so if they drank, they become an alcoholic. But we get guys in there that they've never drank, but their addiction turns to something else, drugs and things like that, So it's just some people are predisposed to it, It's just that's part of it. But it's just we've had people in there who've never had a drink or drug in their life, live great lives and normal lives. They get into an accident and they get hooked on pain pills, and to the point to where they're just buying it off the street or doing things like that, and so it happens, it does, and there's no way of really putting it down that if this person grows up like this, then then they're going to be an alcoholic. They're going to one of the things that was told to me is that someone that's non-alcoholic can as soon as they feel a little bit woozy, they stop. Someone who's an alcoholic or addict, when they start getting a little bit woozy, they want more. They want more. Same with the drugs and things like that. And same with the other addictions, whether it be pornography or whatever. Some people just once they get a hold of it, and it fills that void, even though it's empty and it's gone and there's nothing to it. It's that quick fix that that makes them feel pleasure for a few minutes, or for sometimes a few seconds, and then it's gone.
And then the consequences are remaining.
That's why when that's why falling into after we've been taught to spread the gospel. Once we've been saved, spread the gospel. When I got saved, I wanted to talk about Jesus. There was a change I recognized inside of me. I didn't become perfect. It was a change inside of me, and I worked towards, these things, doing better things and making disciples. That's one of the things we do at the house, We got to fill those things and those attitudes and stuff like that with something else. We have guys that do, once they come through and after they've had some time of recovery and studying the Bible, they do Bible studies there at the house, I was involved, with the Texas mission trip where we went out, had a Bible study with somebody, encouraged them to have a Bible study with someone else, Those things, I mentioned I had a purpose, when when you took drugs and alcohol away from me, I didn't have a purpose. When I got saved, that was the Great Commission. That gave me a purpose. That
New
gave me
positive
something.
direction in your life, right?
That gave me a purpose. That's what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to carry the gospel, make disciples. That's what I'm supposed to do. That was my purpose. And the source, I'll go back to it again, the source of my joy is in Jesus, because that will never fail me,
Yeah.
And it's hard to hear that when someone has no clue about Jesus, no clue about what that's about, but, it's hard, but I know today that that's where I've come to,
Right. Well, do this for me, because we are running a little close on time. We'll go one by one, kind of practical points. There's people watching and listening right now who, on an individual and maybe a church level, what can they do? What can they, in what ways can they help in responding to those, even in their own family or in their community, respond to addiction and help out in recovery? What are some practical ways? Let's just go, John, share a couple things that you might have on your mind, and then Sonia, and then Maddie will close out with you.
The first, prayer. Prayer is huge. People prayed me into recovery. Prayer is a big thing.
And what would they be praying for specifically?
They would pray for we say that hit a sufficient enough bottom, and we talk about bottoms. That's where we figure out that I can't do this. I've got to surrender. Help me. That type of thing.
So you pray that someone would get to that point.
A sufficient enough bottom to that where they would turn and ask for help.
Okay.
That's the prayer, and prayer that God keeps them alive. That needs to be added. That God keeps them alive till they find a sufficient enough bottom to where they can turn. And pray for themselves. If you're trying to help someone, is help me do the right thing to where it will, instead of enabling them, and we could go into that big time, enabling and stuff like that. But the biggest thing is if you're trying to help somebody, to reach out to treatment centers and detoxes and things like that, and say, what do I need to do? But ultimately, that person that they're trying to help may not want help at that time. So that's where the prayer comes in. Pray that God helps them, and it might get worse for them before it gets better. And then for the person that's wanting help is, yes, pray, ask God to help you. And that help comes along. Start seeking out the detox center. Start picking up the phone. there's crisis hotlines, things like that, and start going in that direction. Going to, I'll let you talk from the church standpoint, but, having people educated, on recovery inside the church, so that they have a few numbers, because those people that they call will have, if they can't help, they might have a few numbers for someone else in that field. So, some practical things there is just, it's just his biggest thing on my point is prayer. That's one of the biggest things. So.
And don't give up just because it looks pretty bad, because that's what
Yeah.
you're working towards.
Exactly.
That crisis will turn them.
Because a lot of times when people start, they told me, they prayed for me, I get in recovery, and I remembered how bad things got before I got into recovery. I mean, things got worse, and sometimes but it took that in order for me to realize that, okay, I'm done.
Sure.
I ding ding, ring the bell, I'm done. That's it.
Okay.
So.
Sonia?
I think from a community standpoint, we need to better educate ourselves. We don't need to keep our blinders on in this epidemic that we face every day. Like you had said earlier, if you're not personally affected by it, there's someone that that is. And it hits that close to home. So if we could, as a community, educate ourselves more, and then offer support and prayer to those who are doing this every day, especially like people like John, people like Maddie, who are like on the front lines. They need a lot of prayer and a lot of support, and I think sometimes people forget about that. Not to say that it's not important to pray for the addict and alcoholic and the family, but it's the people the counselors and therapists and people like John and Maddie who are helping people every single day. That's something that the community can do. is prayer and education. And then I also have just knowing that there are local resources available. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. You know, that the people you're not alone, and you can reach out. You know, and that's just what I want people to know, that there are resources available, and that we can all just come together, and there's not going to be judgment. I really wish that word could get wiped out of the whole community. Like, please don't judge, you know. Just love them and pray.
Yeah. But for the grace of God, there go I. You know, it's I'll probably just reiterate some things that they have said, but that responsibility that we have as the church to have an understanding of what we can call an affinity group that has a particular affinity for a behavior and or some kind of action. Having an understanding of that will then prompt more clear and intentional prayers. Having an understanding of that affinity group will then cause us to be more effective in our discipleship as Christians and how we are nurturing them, how we are effectively holding addicts that come into our church accountable in that edifying and encouraging way, how it is that we are able to more effectively minister without enabling and causing them more harm than good when we are doing those things.
And not running them out the door when they show up. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and it has everything to do with education. And, you know, from a missions standpoint, if we are going to go to Honduras or something of that nature as the body of Jesus Christ, we are going to spend time understanding that culture, because there's a certain way that people within that culture act. There's a certain system of government. There's a certain system of morality. There's perspectives. There's worldview that are represented within that culture. And oftentimes it is starkly different from the culture from which we're coming from. I know you do a ton of missions, and I know that that's something that you work on a lot as you do mission. Well, as we are on mission in the world of addiction, or in the country of addiction, if you will, we have a real responsibility to understand the culture of that affinity group, what their worldview is, how they are looking at things, so that we can more effectively disciple and, of course, most importantly, engage with the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ that we have just systematically gone through over and over again, and ultimately said that Jesus is the answer. One final thing I would just say is that so much of what we have shared here is entirely scriptural. When it comes to solution, not only the understanding and looking at addiction through a biblical worldview, but also the solutions that have been talked about: discipleship and accountability, the need for community, the making the resources available. All of those things are entirely scriptural. I love that scripture
And
in
the
2
church
Timothy.
actually has those resources. That's what the church is. Everything you just described is what it's supposed to be.
We are the community. Flee youthful lust, but follow righteousness, faith, charity, and peace with them that call on the Lord out of a pure heart. We need one another. We built needy, and that's what the church needs to be, that place where those needs are met for the sake of Jesus Christ and for the uplifting of his kingdom.
Well, if that's the kind of church that we could be, in, it would be a pretty easy place for somebody to come and receive help, right? Is that kind of the conclusion here? Thank you guys so much for being involved and for sharing your heart with us and your work. Thank you for paying attention and listening throughout. We trust that the Lord will use this to impact lives for the gospel. Thank you.